So here we are, the fourth and final episode of the 14th century outbreak of the Black Death here in England. Now today I'm going to focus and concentrate on statistics and give you some idea of the numbers that we were talking about yesterday. And then I'm going to finish by reading to you from pretty stark and quite moving contemporary texts that have survived. I said yesterday that Bristol was almost certainly the first city to be attacked by the Black Death. Well, the population in 1348 has been set at around 10,000, and we can estimate that between 3,500 and 4,000 people from that city perished as a result of the Great Pestilence. In Bath and Wells, not too far away, 40% or 47% actually, 47% of churchmen perish. And in Winchester, the figure has been set at 48.8%. Now that's interesting because you can see they're very, very close. And the nearer we get to the coastline, the higher the ratios. We know that Norwich and Exeter suffered very similar figures to that 48.8%. One serious study was made on the effects of the Great Pestilence on the former hometown of mine, actually, of Farnham in Surrey, which sits right alongside the border with Hampshire. We know that the pottery and brickmaking industries that existed at that time closed down as a direct consequence of the severe losses, which are set at 33%. So you can see already here, we're talking about 48.8% in Norwich, Exeter and Winchester, which are quite close to the shore. But now in Farnham, which is much further inland, we're talking about 33%. Quite interestingly, Canterbury Cathedral escapes the worst effects of the Great Pestilence. Contemporary churchmen, of course, attributed this to the building's religious significance. It's more likely that the complex was given some protection by a quite sophisticated sanitation system that had been installed a few years earlier. I must say that claims, I often hear actually, that the plague wiped out total communities are usually misplaced and inaccurate. There are one or two that were destroyed, and I visited one fairly recently, and that's Ringstead Parva in Norfolk. And we know that that ceased to exist between 1348 and 1351. It's quite wonderful and sad actually to wander over the territory there, the little mounds and settings for former buildings that existed there. But certainly life there, community life there, came to an end between 1348 and 1351. Let's move up to London. Now we have to remember London at that time was quite a small enclosed walled city with a population of around 60,000. It would have been surrounded by little tiny villages that we would now call Greater London. It was a crowded and extremely unpleasant place. Filth and waste created a perfect environment. Citizens were actually aware of the hazards of that awful environment, and they did make attempts to clean up the city, but never to the extent that was required. It's known that so many people died in London that new cemeteries had to be created at Smithfield and Spitaled Croft. Now in the 1980s, the cemetery at Smithfield was excavated. And more recently, local people will know that there's a major railway project under construction. It has been for a few years now, taking people right across London eventually. It's called Crossrail. And that too has found a major cemetery that's been undiscovered for centuries. It was last used in the 1500s, and that too has exposed a number of victims of the Black Death from the 14th century. And what became apparent from the evidence was that the victims were buried carefully, with considerable dignity and respect, despite the intense demands of the day. I think that's incredible. That was not the case in other parts of Europe where we're talking about huge pits. The work did show actually and are continuing to show, because some of the bodies from the recent Crossrail exposures, that the victims of plague did suffer from other forms of illness and problems like malnutrition. The royal family, interestingly, that survived intact with one exception. Poor Joan, who was the daughter of King Edward III, she travelled to Portugal to meet her proposed husband, but unfortunately she caught the plague and died en route. On the 13th of May 1349, the royal surgeon died from the Black Death, and we know that there were heavy losses amongst the dignitaries of the city. I indicated yesterday that the English ecclesiastical records are a very useful template for us to measure up and give some sort of intelligent suggestion as to likely fatality rates. And I think we can say with some certainty that depending on where you lived, as I indicated earlier, 30 to 45% of English people were killed as a result of the Black Death. Now that ratio is quite interesting, because we know that in 1337 actually, 8 years before the Black Death arrived, a poll tax survey had been conducted in England, revealing a population of somewhere around 4.2 million people. So I can tell you that intelligent estimates suggest that 1.8 million people died in England as a result of this great pestilence. Using the same ratio, 25 million approximately died in Europe. 25 million. And you know something, if we use that same ratio today on Europe in its entirety, we would say that 150.4 million people died in Europe. Ooh, incredible figure. Incredible figure. Later attacks of the Black Death after 1348 tended to be regional. They hit small areas rather than the whole country. And after about 100 years, it was very much confined to cities and major towns rather than the villages that it first hit. A useful analogy, I think 14th century citizens experienced this awful event were in a very similar position to occupants of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in August 1945. Because when the atomic bomb was dropped on those two cities, the residents experienced horror and tragedy out of the blue and saw death on a scale never before been experienced. I think the extent and severity of the Black Death might be compared to contemporary problems of HIV and AIDS, which as of 9 years ago, when I first delivered this presentation, was set at around 32 million people. So how did the English react to this trauma? That's something that particularly intrigues me, because now we can start to talk about English character. Well, certainly God-fearing communities, as they were at that time, were put in fear, absolute terror. And students of the period have compared the psychological effects to what was experienced by residents of cities like London and Dresden and Coventry and Berlin that were bombed during the Second World War. In this country we call it the Blitz, didn't we? Researchers have suggested that much like 1348, citizens would have experienced common patterns of behaviour. There would have been initial anger against an enemy. In 1348, that enemy would have been unseen, of course. There would have been vows of vengeance, followed quite quickly by a sense of pride in collective solidarity and courage to overcome this trauma. I can tell you that in Europe there was widespread disorder, but that wasn't the case in England. Business did continue, but very much on different terms. I think the biggest threat to villages particularly were travellers. Communities shut themselves away and visitors or potential visitors were shunned for obvious reasons. What were the consequences, short and long term, for England? Well, I can tell you they were pretty severe, and they really did change the nature of England, and to some extent, I think, the English. I have to say, from a historical point of view, it's important to understand that the plague did accelerate changes that were already underway in the 14th century. But what the plague did do was have a profound effect on the ownership of land, because landlords found themselves in a very unfamiliar position. They were no longer able to call the tune as they had done since the Norman invasion, really. There were insufficient labourers to tend their land. So huge amounts of England were made available for sale, and citizens who could afford it began to purchase their own little bit of England, their own little plots. Those who were wise enough, and rich enough of course, made a grab for the largest amount of territory that they possibly could. And I have to say, today's great landowners, if we research their background, many of them first acquired these huge tracts of land at this time. There was very much a dramatic reduction in the workforce. The working man for the very first time could flex his muscles, demand better prices and working conditions. He travelled far more to get a better price, and skilled labour became a valuable commodity. There was a huge impact on building projects because skilled masons had been killed in huge numbers, and they were no longer capable of carving the intricate patterns that we see on some of the Norman buildings in that period. Most of the styles coming from Europe, and particularly France. So simpler styles were employed. And what came to the fore? The famous English perpendicular architecture. Best seen, of course, at King's College Chapel in Cambridge. There was a large gap now in the number of academics, and losses in those who taught French. There was an increase in the use of English for education and legal purposes, and once again, and about time too, I suggest, English became the language of the royal court, synonymous with the national pride generated by the successes of Edward III and his son, the Black Prince. The church obviously lost a lot of academics and writers, which threatened the education of young men throughout England. And new colleges grew out of the ashes. I think the best example, in my opinion, is the Winchester School, one of the oldest, if not the oldest actually, in England, which was built as a direct result of losses incurred during the Black Death. Of all the consequences, I think the best and most obvious, best known and most obvious, is one that I've talked about previously in this presentation. And that was the Church of England was never the same again. The majority felt that the church had neglected its duty to the population and let them down. There were concerns about this over-wealthy church that seemed more interested in its own survival than the welfare of parishioners came right to the fore of people's thinking. The unquestioning authority enjoyed by the church here in England came to an end. New doctrines were proposed and courageously, in some cases, explored. There was very much a desire for a back-to-basics approach to religion, and that in turn led further down the line to the Reformation, which took hold in England quite easily for these very reasons. There was an attempt to cut priests out from the process of worship, and people were seeking more private forms of devotion, and we see the growth of chantry chapels for private prayers, and the development, as you've heard many times now, of the cult of saints. John Wycliffe in 1382 starts his translation of the Bible into English. There was very much a desire at this time for the medical profession to better understand the causes of plague, obviously. We know that the papal physician, a guy called Chauliac, understood and could articulate two different forms of the plague. And he was able to identify the symptoms of each, actually. Sadly, it was the church that tended to keep the doctors in their place, so medicine didn't develop as one might hope and expect. What happened next? Well, after 1348, the plague revisited England many, many times, but it was never quite as devastating as the original outbreak. To some extent, I think people were able to prepare for it. They knew what to do, although even that was limited. It hit about 20% of English villages over the next 2 centuries. In the 5th reign of Elizabeth I, that's 1563, we know that 25% of Londoners were killed by the outbreak of plague. Of course, famously further down the line, nearly 3 centuries later, it was recorded in the diary of Dr. Samuel Pepys. It killed 56,000 inhabitants of London at that time. But I think the most poignant monument to the last throw of the dice for the Black Death is the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, and I shall be talking about that marvellous place in a separate presentation. Remarkably, during the 17th century, specifically 1666, the plague retreated from the known world just as quickly and dramatically as it had arrived. This can be explained in some respects by better hygiene and sanitation, and interestingly more resilient building materials, which protected population from pandemics and restricted the ability of rats to live with people in their homes. For example, the removal of thatched roofs to be replaced by tiles and eventually bricks in the structures. In summary, let's just go through a very quick list of what did the Black Death do to us or for us. Well, it certainly gave us a new society and a new geographical map, but it also allowed the working man to break free from the shackles of feudalism. It gave status to the working men's skills and crafts. Huge tracts of land were forced onto the market, not previously available to the main population, but now the working people could actually grab their own little bit of England for the first time. It gave primacy to simpler forms of architecture, particularly the English perpendicular style. It changed forever the relationship between the English and the church, gave a boost to the English language, which developed to become the primary source of communication in the world. It led to the creation of new schools, university colleges and buildings. And of course it created the void that was filled by the cults of the Virgin Mary and St. George. For these reasons, I suggest I'm quite right when I said at the start of this presentation, the Black Death remains the most significant and catastrophic event ever witnessed on these shores. Let me finish by reading to you from some contemporary sources. I've got 5 that I want to read to you. The first is the most lengthy, but bear with it, because you're hearing events through the eyes and the mouth and via the pen of a man who actually witnessed events for himself. In this case, it's an introduction to the Decameron, 10 tales or 10 stories that translates to, by a man called Giovanni Boccaccio in Florence. And we're talking about early 1348. And he wrote this: in the early spring of the year we have mentioned, that is 1348, the plague began in a terrifying and extraordinary manner to make its disastrous effects apparent. It is a remarkable story that I have to relate, and were it not for the fact that I am one of many people who saw it with their own eyes, I would scarcely dare to believe it, let alone commit it to paper. One day, for instance, the rags of a pauper who had died from the disease were thrown into the street. where they attracted the attention of two pigs. In their wonted fashion, the pigs first of all gave the rags a thorough mauling with their snouts, after which they took them between their teeth and shook them against their cheeks. Within a short time, I saw that they began to writhe as though they had been poisoned. Then they both dropped dead to the ground, spread eagled upon the rags that had brought about their undoing. Boccaccio goes on to say, such was the multitude of corpses of which further consignments were arriving every day and almost by the hour at each of the churches, that there was not sufficient consecrated ground for them to be buried in, especially if each was to have his own plot, in accordance with long established custom. So when the graves were full, huge trenches were excavated in those churchyards, upon which new arrivals were placed in their hundreds, stowed tier upon tier like ship's cargo, each layer of corpses being covered over with a thin layer till the trench was filled to the top. Let me take you to an extract next from a letter dated and written on the 24th of October 1348 by the Bishop of Winchester, a man called Edendon. It was addressed to the clergy in his huge diocese, which interestingly included Farnham that I referred to earlier. He wrote this: a voice has been heard in Ramah, and much lamentation and mourning has echoed through various parts of the world. Nations bereft of their children, alas, in the abyss of unprecedented pestilence, refuse to be comforted. We are struck by terror, lest, may God avert it, this brutal disease should rage in any part of our city or diocese. But it is to be feared that the most likely explanation is that human sensuality has now plumbed greater depths of evil, producing a multitude of sins which have provoked the divine anger. Classic example of the response I referred to in the second presentation. Then an extract from a letter written by King Edward III, actually, to his bishops a year after the plague arrived, and it's dated the 5th of September 1349, and he makes a plea to his bishops in this form: from the depth of our heart we beseech you, who have chosen to make offerings and sacrifices for sins on behalf of mankind, to offer God devout prayers and sacrifices for our salvation and that of the people, so that God might repel the plague and illness. The same year, 1349, written some time between May and June of that year, another famous Italian Florentine poet, Petrarch writes this: what are we to do, brother, now that we have lost almost everything and found no rest? When can we expect it? Where shall we look for it? Time, as they say, has slipped through our fingers. Our former hopes are buried with our friends. A clear sign of desperation there. And finally, I want to read to you for a letter which would be very amusing were it not so tragic and the consequences so awful. But it concerns a potential invasion by Scots into England when they heard of what the English were suffering. It's a chronicle written and dated 1390, written by a man called Nineton, who was an Augustinian monk. And he tells us this: the Scots, hearing of the cruel plague of the English, declared that it had befallen them through the revenging hand of God, and they took to swearing by the foul death of England, or so the common report resounded in the ears of the English. And thus the Scots, believing that the English were overwhelmed by this terrible vengeance of God, gathered in the forest of Selkirk with the intention of invading the whole realm of England. But the fierce mortality came upon them, and the sudden cruelty of a monstrous death winnowed the Scots. Within a short space of time, around 5,000 died, and the rest, weak and strong alike, decided to retreat to their own country, but the English following surprised them and killed many of them. With that, I'll say goodbye. I hope you found the presentation on the 14th century Black Death of interest.